Hey everyone, this is Car Ray Rob.
Where I'm Ray.
And I'm Rob. And we want to welcome you to a brand new episode of A Copy of a Copy.
A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy. A copy of a copy.
That's right, everybody. We are back with a new episode of A Copy of a Copy. I am super excited about this one. But before we get to it, I don't want to jump the gun. Tell everybody what we do here, Rob.
Absolutely. Here on A Copy of a Copy, Ray and I, we look at originals and remakes. And we've kind of dissect why they were made. Maybe try to find out different kinds of remakes. And maybe in some ways defend the remake.
Yeah.
So it's not just, disregarded whole cloth right out of the gate as some kind of an inherent evil.
I think a lot of times remakes do get the connotation of being just money grabs or bad.
Absolutely.
We have found so many different good reasons for making remakes on this show.
Yep.
It's been a joy to do that this last year and a half now.
I know, it's insane.
Wow.
I can't even believe it. Yeah, and I think this one is definitely going to fall into a category that I don't know if we've come up with a name for it, but I'm just going to call this it had to be remade. It had to be remade.
That's a good one.
and as for you listeners who have listened to our recent episode of Say Hello to My Little Film will know that this is my birthday month.
Yes.
So we have decided to do something hella fun that both Ray and I are going to really enjoy, and that is because we are going to be looking at the 1984 space epic Dune.
Just okay.
Which was David Lynch's bastard child he doesn't like to talk about, and the 2021-2024 Denis Villeneuve Dune and Dune Part 2. So this is a three-parter.
We are doing Dune Part 1 and 2, yeah.
So
one book.
One book, so we're doing a three-parter. We have not done this since Nosferatu.
Yeah.
But I am super pumped to do this
Yeah.
because I am a big fan of Dune, fan of the books, fan of the movies, so this is going to be just a lot of fun. And as I said, remake needed to be made.
Absolutely. Like Rob said, we both have read not all the books, but there's a ton. But we've read a lot of them. We've read more. We've read past where we're at in the movies, that's for sure, and past where they're at in the next movie, depending on how that one gets structured.
Right.
But we are doing the new Denis Villeneuve's Part 1 and Part 2 because that covers the first book, and that's what the 1984 movie does as well. It covers the entire first book.
Absolutely. And as I said, David Lynch, who we have covered on this show before because we watched Blue Velvet, he directed this movie, and it feels like a weird choice. And it became kind of a notoriously bad choice for him because he had so many problems with the studio and the script and everything else, and just getting his head around the subject matter that eventually it became a bit of a mess. But it is kind of a cult mess, if you will, because there are people that really do hold this movie in high regard, and I don't necessarily not see why. I think stylistically there's a lot of very interesting things that they did with this movie, especially with the production design and things of that nature. But the fact that they didn't do the whole book, that they kind of glossed over a lot of the more meaty excerpts of the book and things like that, really just kind of goes to show why Denis had to make this movie and make it two parts. Which, to be fair, David Lynch wanted to make his version two parts, but they wouldn't let him do it.
Yeah, you really do have to make this two parts. The books are so dense.
Yeah,
it's almost I kind of compare reading Dune to almost like reading Shakespeare in a way because it's so psychological. There's so much about it that is like thinking about the future and people's thoughts and reactions, and it's so much about the mind, where a lot of times books, they describe the setting, they describe what things look like. Dune describes the mind.
Yeah.
And that can be very dense and very hard to get on screen,
right,
especially if you're rushing through it.
it explained why David Lynch could have been a really good choice to do this, because the book, while it is a science fiction book, does have a lot of ethereal elements to it,
Yeah.
kind of not supernatural, but psychedelic even elements to it that I think David Lynch could have lended himself really well to. But when you're dealing with a studio, you're at their mercy and things just kind of happen.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know what Dune is about, it is about the planet of Arrakis and a family coming to, I guess, take over the fiefdom, if you will, of Arrakis, because the Harkonnen family has been pushed out.
Yeah. They're being handed that. They're not like they're not taking it over by force.
Correct.
Or anything.
They are being gifted this. The Atreides family is being gifted this planet, and they are to oversee the extraction of melange, or spice, which is basically the fuel of the universe. It's what makes space travel possible.
And it's also one hell of a drug.
It's also one hell of a drug, exactly. But the Fremen inhabit the planet of Arrakis, or Dune, and it obviously kind of makes more of a political gambit of owning and operating and running this planet. And Paul Atreides, who becomes the
original Luke Skywalker,
kind of the original Luke Skywalker in a way, is the son of the Atreides son, and he kind of has to, I guess, take over as the family befalls some pretty unfortunate times. Don't want to give too much away if you haven't seen it.
And then prophecy kicks in from there.
Prophecy kicks in from there, exactly.
So we won't ruin it in case you haven't seen it, but it's a heck of a book. Huge cast, awesome cast, especially the new ones with Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Dave Bautista.
Yeah.
I mean, the list goes on and on.
Absolutely. And even the original in 84, you got Kyle MacLachlan, Patrick Stewart, Brad Dourif, Dean Stockwell, Virginia Madsen, Jose Ferrer, Sean Young, Sting, Max von
Sting is in this.
Like, not that there was any slouch when it came to the original film as well. So it's just, but it is a movie to behold. And so if you have not ever seen that one, I am excited for people to watch that. And maybe see some of the redeeming elements. I think that's part of it as well. I don't want to go into this being like, this movie's terrible.
Yeah.
And we're just going to sit here and talk about how great Denis is and how terrible David Lynch's is. I don't want that to be that way.
No. It might, but no.
It might.
No,
in some regards.
I've seen the original Dune, and it didn't leave like a lasting impression on me one way or the other. Like, it wasn't great, it wasn't bad. The new ones I do think are great. And you know what's fun? Like, we are book fans. This is one of those few series where I'm like, they've made changes from the books, and I've been okay with it. I think they've all made sense, and the overall quality is still there. So definitely. I'm really excited to go back and watch these two movies.
Absolutely. Three movies. And that's what we're going to do right now. We are going to go watch these three movies, Dune 1984, Dune, and Dune Part 2. And we invite you to do the same. Come and celebrate my birthday, because this movie, I love Dune. I love Dune. I'm so excited to do this. I'm so excited for this conversation. So go check out these movies, pause the podcast, and then come back and find out what Ray and I have to say about how these remakes stack up.
Ray and Rob are currently watching the film. Wait, films? There are two? How long is this supposed to take? I've got places to be, you know. Ray and Rob will be right back when they're done watching the films.
All right, guys, we are back. Me and Rob have watched 7 hours of Dune. We've been Duning a while here.
We've been in the desert for 7 hours, but you know what? It doesn't feel like it's been 7 hours.
It passed by like a sandstorm. So I think for me, the thing that just jumps out at me, and you can't ignore it, it's fairly obvious, that the new Dunes were 2 movies and the 1984 was 1 movie.
What? We just watched 3 movies?
Not 4, though, right?
Not 4.
We're not doing a copy of like where both of these tackled book 1 the same exact way.
Right.
1984 had to get it all a very dense book done in 1 movie.
Yeah.
Where somebody saw that movie 30 years later, said, I'm going to give you guys $400 million to make 2 movies and probably another 200 to make a third to actually tell this story. And that is where the difference of these 2 movies, to me, really lies.
Yeah, no, I think that is fair. And we want to be fair to David Lynch, because even when he doesn't want it want us to
He
be fair
hates the
because he
movie.
hates this movie. I think that's the funniest thing about it is he hates this movie. So any derogatory things we would say about the movie, I don't think he would begrudge us. However, I am going to say, I'll preface it now. I do have some good things to say about 1984, and I think that's also an exciting thing as well. Like I said, it had been a minute since I revisited it, but yeah, I think it would be really easy for us to sit here and just beat 1984 over the head and be like, well, part 1 and part 2 did it better.
No.
And it's like, well, yeah, because time.
Right.
The biggest enemy in 1984 was time. But I think that there's some great comparisons, some good homages, both from the part 1, part 2 to 1984 to discuss, but it's not all bad.
No, it's not all bad. I think there's a good movie in 1984, and that good movie is what the new one's made. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
But it's just like when you have to rush through some things, when your real estate is so tight, that runtime of your movie, it's going to make it challenging. There's going to be things that you can do well, and there's going to be things that you have to rush through. And I think basically what you would call Dune Part 2, which is a dense 2.5-hour movie, is the last 40 minutes of 1984.
Roughly, yeah. They basically kind of just sail through that. Like once the Fremen take in Paul and Lady Jessica, it feels like it's an entire second movie in part 2, but it's about 40-45 minutes in the 1984 version, and there's so much in that time span that gets to that. It feels with part 1. Obviously, the overthrow of House Atreides, like it's such a big part of that movie. They're really the last act of that movie is just them escaping into the desert and then ultimately running into Stilgar and the rest of the Fremen and convincing them to let them come along. But in the book, I think that's probably the first third.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of time jumps, a lot of characters and stuff that didn't make it into any of the movies, but like. That's 2/3 of a book. That basically become a second movie, and in Dune 84 they turn it into 45 minutes, and that's next to impossible. And
I think where it hurts is basically when you watch these two movies, I kind of feel like Paul is in a completely different place at the end of 1984 because they skip through part 2, and where he is in the new ones because in part 2 you really see Paul challenged, and he so reluctantly takes on this mantle of the leader of the Fremen. Like that was never his goal. Where in 1984, because they have to skip over that, they basically make it seem like this is his goal. He wants to use the Fremen for not for power, but I guess for revenge.
Right.
And he wants to get even with the Harkonnens and the Emperor, and this is his method to do it. Where Paul wanted to do those things, but he did not want to do it as the leader of the Fremen in part 2, and that comes across so much clearer.
Yeah, there's a lot of gravity around that decision for Paul in part 2. To embrace the idea of becoming the Kwisatz Haderach and becoming Muad'Dib and all of this stuff. Like there's a lot of gravity around those decisions. And like you said, a lot of inner turmoil that Paul Atreides goes through to even allow himself to be pulled into that that mysticism side of the Fremen.
Right.
And you're right. In 84, it almost it's kind of baked into the cake. And let's talk a little bit about the characters.
Point out some differences.
Let's talk a little bit about the characters, and we'll take some of them one at a time. And just kind of like, and again, not say which one's necessarily better or worse. That's not exactly what we're trying to do. But like you said, kind of point out some of the differences. So yeah, in 84, I think Kyle MacLachlan's performance overall of Paul feels very weird.
Yeah, I'd call it wooden.
Almost, yeah, and he's almost kind of like this Pollyanna type element to him, where he seems very excited about everything, and then they do try to kind of give him a bit of an arc by the end, where he seems a little more serious. But I never really buy into that.
Mm-hmm.
Like the leader side that Paul is supposed to become, this great leader, this mythical leader. I never really buy MacLachlan doing that. Now, and it's really nothing to do with him as an actor, because I love Kyle MacLachlan, and I mean, we'll talk more about this with his relationship with David Lynch going forward after this, I'm sure later. But as far as this specific movie goes, like I would not call him a shining spot of this movie.
No.
Necessarily.
Yeah, which is tough because like this is your Luke Skywalker. This is the guy who's becoming the leader and claiming this birthright.
Yeah.
But because it's so easily gained, like he's never challenged by the Fremen because they just, basically the Fremen have to kind of be ignored as in 1984.
Yeah.
Because they are skipping like what became part 2 of the new of Denis movies. Like he just gets to tell the Fremen what he wants to do or what to do, and he's just kind of like he's just their leader. It's like I kind of think of the when he wanted to ride the worm.
Yeah.
In 1984, he's just like, I want to do this. I want to show I can do it, so that they'll continue to follow me. But like, they would never allow him to do that in the part 2. The real Fremen weren't gonna,
Right.
And from the books,
It took him a
we're
lot
not
to
gonna weren't gonna let you do that. Yeah. And so like Paul earning their trust and doing all these things, like slowly checking these boxes to not just take over these people and say I'm going to be the ruler of you just because he wanted to, but because it's earned and it happens so naturally. Like there's even a line, even Chani who wants in part 2, Chani who wants Paul to lead them less than anybody. Says like sometimes fate makes our decisions for us. Like he had to go down this road to become their the prophet, the prophecy, the Messiah of the Fremen. And so like all that weight is just not in 1984 because they just can't invest into that part of the book.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is there were supposed to be sequels to 1984.
Yeah,
but I think
still would have had to skip those things. Well, unless they were going to make this 2 parts.
Right, and that's my whole point is that they with part 1 and part 2 they were clearly setting up a third.
Yeah,
already they were setting up for Dune Messiah. Whereas Dune 84 just seems like it's a movie all onto itself.
Right.
They cut out a lot of the stuff that the decisions that Paul makes at the end of the movie that changes the course of history for the Atreides family, for the Fremen, for the Landsrat in general, all that kind of stuff, and they just kind of don't even bother with it. And I think the slow walk in part 1 and part 2 of the build up of Paul becoming Muad'Dib,
fulfilling this prophecy,
right? It really works, and they try it in 84. There's a couple of scenes that I can think of that are almost in some ways almost mirror images. We kind of talked about part 1 and part 2 kind of homaging 84 in some ways, and it's not like it's not in the book, because again that's the ultimate source material. But I think about the scene with Dr. Liet Kynes and the still suits before they go out to observe the spice collection, and obviously it's Max von Sydow in 84, and he does almost verbatim what they do in part 1, where they have him, have you worn a still suit before? He's like, this is my first time. It's like, you have it fitted this way. It's like, well, it's just the way it's supposed to be. And so those little things, that kind of happen, and then, even like with Stilgar and stuff like that, getting him into part 1, whereas 84, like you said, they don't even meet Stilgar until after the whole fall of the House Atreides, and those little moments add to that building tension, if you will, of Paul kind of creating this, or fulfilling this prophecy, becoming this Messiah.
Yeah, because the new Dunes make you slowly see this prophecy being filled, whether it be people starting to acknowledge it, like Kynes there when they noticed the still suit, Stilgar, basically the whole move, both part 1s and part 2, where just everything Paul does is reaffirming to him, in his beliefs. But even when Paul drinks the water of life, what's supposed to save him, or what was it? It's escaping me, but it's Chani's secret name. It's like tears from the spring.
It's desert.
Desert tears.
Yeah, desert. Hold on, I got it written down here. Desert spring tears.
Okay, I had it back.
Desert spring
so
tears.
Close. Yeah, but so Chani being the desert spring tears for him, that revives him. It's like all these things are the prophecy slowly being fulfilled. Whereas in 1984, it's almost like everybody already believes he's the Messiah, and they're just checking the box. Like, oh, he checked this box because he wore the still suit, right? Oh, he checked this box. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like he doesn't have to work to win them over. So it's just, like you said, all that weight is just missing, and it makes Paul in 1984 just less interesting.
Yeah.
And non-viable.
Well, and I think another interesting element of part 2 especially is how Paul kind of resists the idea of him being this Messiah, even once he's with the Fremen.
Right.
He kind of sides with Chani and the cynics about who he is, and not the fundamentalists and all of that. And I think that it's such a great added layer to the depth of the character about him kind of trying to fight against the coming storm, if you will, or the prophecy, whatever word you want to use. And I think him ultimately giving in, once he does take the water of life, it makes it feel all the more of not a startling change, but just a more felt change.
Yeah. Well, and just even look at like the name Muad'Dib. Like in 1984 version, like they make Muad'Dib kind of sound like it's cool because it does sound cool to say. I feel like Muad'Dib, Muad'Dib. It sounds cool, but like it means desert mouse. So it really is like almost. It's almost like a jab at himself, and that's kind of why I think he picks it. Like it's a small, innocent thing. It's adapted to the desert. It's not natural to the desert,
right?
You know, and so like, and I think in part 2, like when Paul's picking that name, it's not like he's picking something that is like he didn't call himself the Sandworm, and he's going to rule over everybody. He picked the smallest,
Shai-Hulud or something.
Yeah, he picked the smallest, most innocent thing in the desert, like unnoticeable. If you're not paying attention,
right?
Because that's what he wanted.
But a survivor, nonetheless.
But a survivor,
master of the desert.
But and I think that it encompasses Paul, but it shows you that he's not here to just take over. You know what I mean? Like he didn't, like I said. Whereas in 1984, they kind of they don't explain what Muad'Dib means. They just kind of say that they say it in a way where, oh, that sounds cool. That must be awesome. To be called that.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right in pointing out that scene, because in '84, that the whole weight of the naming of Paul Atreides feels like
whatever
afterthought. You know, and in part 2, that whole scene has a lot of weight to it. Like you said, not just the explanation of Muad'Dib and Stilgar, kind of agreeing with him for picking this name and defending him when people kind of laugh at him. They just kind of say, you're going to be called Usul,
right,
which is the bottom of the column, and then we're the base of the column, and then we're going to name you Muad'Dib because it's Stilgar just says it, and it's just like, it's okay, why, why?
How'd you pick that?
Right, it's just I just thought it out of the air, just picked it
First
out
thing
of the air.
popped in my head. Yeah, and so well, let's kind of expand even beyond Paul, and I think an interesting character to talk about will be Chani, because we are book lovers, and Chani in part 2 I think is great, but she's way different than she is in the books. And in 1984, she's really not in the movie. Other than she kisses Paul in a couple scenes, and that's basically it.
Yeah, and I love Sean Young, so the fact that they kind of did her dirty in '84 makes me a little mad. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you about in part 1, part 2, the portrayal of Chani, I think, is different, definitely different than the book. And I think Zendaya does a great job of kind of playing up this cynicism that does not exist really in Chani in the book, in the way that...
But it's a great character to emphasize this.
Absolutely. And if I can actually, maybe this is sacrilege for some, but if I could point at something that I feel like you could say the movies did better than the books, I'm going to say it's Chani.
Yeah,
because
I agree with you.
While I like Chani in the books, she does feel very subservient, to Paul Atreides, and even going into the future books as well. But like just this idea of her kind of being skeptical and like having this, I guess, reticence to fall prey to the fundamentalist beliefs and the mysticism of the Fremen in that way, like the South and the North, that kind of thing. I think it actually makes her really relatable, especially to like modern audiences, especially to younger people, who have these, adults in their life who kind of believe these kind of ridiculous things, and you're like, why? You know? Now, granted, again, Paul ends up giving in to them in the end, and I think her response to that in part 2 is great. Where she has that anger towards him, and ultimately ends up leaving him by the end of part 2, which makes me very excited to see what they do with Messiah, because that's not what happens in Messiah.
Yeah, in the books, she's still very much that character that teaches him how to survive in the desert and stuff. Which again, 1994, since they're going to skip most of that anyway, they just basically cut her from the movie.
Yeah.
But so she's not like just some like side character. Chani is big in the books. Like, so she serves a role, but she doesn't push back in the way that she is in Dune part 1 and part 2. She's giving you a different point of view, and I agree. I think it's an upgrade over the movie. And so again, we're not just people that are just nerds to the book. I think it's an upgrade in the movie, but I do think, this is a side story. We're not going to expand on this till maybe Messiah comes out. But like, it definitely is going to be much harder to do Dune part 3 with them not together than because obviously they're very much together at the end of the book in part 1 and at the end of the book.
Right. Yeah. Well, but it, so going kind of comparing the movies that we're talking about right now, in '84, this is, well, I almost hesitate to bring up Erlon yet, because I feel like we can kind of talk about her in her own in her own right. But in this instance, I'll
Might as
bring her
well.
up because they don't even go. She's basically wasted in 1984. You know, Virginia Madsen is in there as Erlon, and she does the
Opening monologue.
The opening monologue, which again is very much like the book. Like Erlon is kind of telling aspects of this story like through the first book, but then by the end of the part two, Dune Part 2, it ends the way the book does, where Paul chooses or takes Erlon as his wife to kind of gain control over the Landsrad, and that's like a huge part of like his relationship with Chani too, because Chani becomes almost like his concubine, like Lady Jessica was, but like on the side, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so when the children come along later, that obviously adds crazy
That's a
layers.
little tension, yeah.
Right, it adds crazy layers because and even between Erlon and Paul. So I will be curious to see how Denis handles that in a third movie. But at least they did it at all. Where, like I said, in 1984, they basically just jettisoned it, and Erlon becomes almost useless.
She's a prop on that stands
More or
next to
less,
the Emperor
yeah.
later. And one thing they have to ignore too is that Paul has Harkonnen blood in him. And if you're not going to make sequels and stuff I guess it just doesn't matter. But that's another thing you just have to skip over, which we get that taste of. It's a great twist toward the end of the book that Paul has to kind of digest, and it's a great twist toward at the end of part 2 as well. Let's switch gears and talk about just the production a little bit, because as you kind of mentioned Erlon and kind of the way to tell the story. She opens up with that monologue, and then I feel like there's so much exposition in 1984.
Yeah.
I feel like they're so scared that the audience is not going to be able to keep track of these 4 planets, these 3 houses, and all these motivations of why it's happening. I feel like they over explain a little bit. Even that first scene with the Emperor, he tells you the whole movie.
Right.
He literally tells you I'm secretly putting the Harkonnens against the Atreides, then they're going to go to war, and then I'm going to come in and I'm like, you literally just told the audience the entire. Why am I going to watch the rest of it? You just told us everything that's going to happen.
I don't disagree with that. and they in part 1 there is they do as well in a different way. You know what I mean? When they're talking when the Reverend Mother Mahayam goes to see the Baron and all of that, and they kind of do the cone of silence thing.
Yeah.
Get smart, but and then but yeah, when they're basically begs for Paul Atreides' life, which again is different in 84 because the mining guild want him dead,
right?
So it's kind of interesting having the mining guild in there, which they don't do that much in part 1 and part 2 to that degree, but it is an interesting thing from the book, because the mining guild, thank you, is
You'll get there.
such a big point of the books. But I think in defense, so I did talk about some of the good things about 84. I am going to defend it a little bit. I have
no problem with that. I don't dislike it.
Right, but I can definitely see where you're coming from about how it feels like a lot. But for a movie that is okay, I've got this massive novel to get across in a very complicated system in a complicated world. I got to world build at least something. They did attempt it. Where I do feel like in Dune Part 1 and Part 2, they just kind of let you go along for the ride a bit and don't really explain it.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit here and there. So I do think ultimately that does work better. Part 1 and Part 2, but I'm going to give 84 a lot of credit for at least trying, because that there's going to be people that are going to be watching the movie even Part 1 and Part 2 and I don't understand any of the inner workings of the politics of this, and it's the book is such a dense political read, and it's hard and an amazing political book just from a political point of view, political strategy and people, that kind of stuff. And I think I can understand why somebody like David Lynch would want to at least try to get as much of that into the movie as he could.
Yeah. So when you read a book like Dune, a lot of authors, when you're reading their stories, they really explain the environment and what the trees are like and what the clouds look like and all your surroundings, and they paint that mental picture for you about the world that you're living in. But when you read Dune, and I've always felt this, it's he paints the mental picture of what they're thinking, the same way most authors would display what they're seeing. And it's very hard. It's almost like Shakespeare, where it's you have to get into the rhythm of knowing how he writes these books, so that you can, before it starts to almost make sense, because it can be very challenging to read. and because of that, like I said, it is so dense. And one thing that, again, I feel like in 1984, again, this just talking about this as an adaptation and how they kind of do it different than two movies, but like there's so much inner monologue work done.
Yeah.
Like every character, like you can hear their thoughts, and sometimes the thoughts are not like really adding to the scene that much.
Sure.
Maybe they are trying to like do what they're doing in the books and letting
I
you.
think so.
you
Yeah,
think-
that's
so
what I
that-
think is
yeah.
the likelihood of it.
They're trying to do, because it is so much like inner thought and thinking about what is that person thinking about what I'm thinking right now, and like who can read my mind in this room. There's so much of that in the books, but when like having the actors do it, it's just so much in 1984. It feels like they're saying things that I can see with my eyes that the actors are expressing. Where in a
Yeah.
book you do have to kind of like, how is he reacting to what I just said, because I can't see that.
Yeah.
But like in the book, he's like, I am, like inner thought would be, or in 1984, it's like inner thought is like, I'm mad at him right now,
Right.
or she's scared of him, or like I can tell she's scared of him. Her eyes are like bugged out of her head. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it just feels like wasted time sometimes. But I guess I see what they're trying to do there.
Well, yeah, and I think about how they kind of handled that in part 1 and part 2, because obviously that's a big part of the Bene Gesserit as an organization, is their ability to read people, tell when they're lying, tell, all of that, and breaking down every little movement.
You can't lie in front of them because they'll know.
Because they'll know, exactly. And there's even times when, especially at the end of part 2, when the Emperor comes to Dune and all of that, and they're... he brings the Baron and Fayed and Rabin in front of them, and they're like trying to explain to him,
Right.
like, oh, we think this or that, Muad'Dib's dead and all these things, and they're telling the truth, like
Right.
they believe everything they're saying, and the Reverend Mother Mohayim knows that, and like signals to the Emperor with her hands, they're not lying, they're telling the truth, and that kind of stuff's all in the book, that kind of
absolutely.
stuff. So I again, like it's a choice you have to make. Like, am I going to try to explain this to people, or am I just going to take the risk that they are not going to understand what's happening here?
And again, I think because there's time in the new ones, they're able to like let the audience have time to figure it out. Where in 1984, because you're trying to do the whole thing in one movie, you're like, we don't have time for you to figure this out. We're going to tell you what's going on so
Right.
that you don't get confused at the next thing that's happening.
Right.
And so that's just the challenge. And that's, again, I think this remake is because whoever watched 1984 said there's a good movie in there. It needs more time. And then we're gonna make the remake that's giving it the story time. And obviously it's paid off.
Yeah.
But like I said, there, as we've been pointing out, there are some of those sacrifices. Let's give 1984 props, because one super hard thing to challenge that Denis did not try to challenge was Alia,
Yes.
Paul's sister.
Yeah.
You might watch part 1, part 2, and forget, if you're like not a huge fan of the books, forget that Paul has a sister, because she's not born yet in
Right.
the book, in the movies, but she is born before the end of the book.
Yeah, obviously it's such a long book. There's a lot of time jumps. There's a lot of time jumps between the books as well. So Alia is, obviously a big character by the end of the first book, and a major character going into the future books.
Huge character.
Huge character. And you're right. Like, so this is a thing that I'm gonna split down the middle, because I think I'm gonna give props to 1984 for trying.
Yeah.
Like you said, it'd be. Like the way that she is in the book, being 3 years old or whatever, 4 years old,
Yeah.
not even, I think, and having that preternatural kind of mind of a Reverend Mother, since
She
she
has
was
an-
in the wound when Jessica took the water of
Yeah.
life, so now she's herself also a Reverend Mother.
So she's like an abomination in the books, where she's like 3 years old but can talk to people like an adult,
Right,
which is like
exactly.
very kind of scary.
Yeah, and I think I have to give credit to David Lynch for at least attempting it, knowing that, yes, he wasn't going to get an actress who looked as young as she needed to be and be able to speak, with that kind of gravitas. So, but he did find a young actress who was able to at least somewhat pantomime what was supposed to be said, and then dubbed her voice with an older person's voice. And I think that I think that worked perfectly well.
I think it was super effective.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I actually really appreciate how they handled Alia. Denis handled Alia in part 1 and part 2, part 2, but mostly. But the idea of her being in the womb, obviously, when the water of life happened, and then she's in the womb for the rest of the movie,
Right. She can speak to her mother,
right,
and through thought a
Yeah.
little bit, but she's not ever born.
Right, exactly. So, and she's in a dream sequence once because you
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
see,
Anna
Anya
Taylor-Joy.
Taylor-Joy, thank you, who is going to clearly be her in Messiah. But like I said, I think for a character that it would conceivably be so hard to portray
Almost
convincingly,
impossible.
right, on film, I think both films found a way to do it admirably.
Yeah.
Maybe if Alia had been on screen more in part one, it may have like started feeling a little more wonky.
Hmm.
But because I think she was on screen the perfect amount, and even having that last scene in the the throne room, if you will, with the Emperor, where she was like, "Wait for my brother,"
Yeah,
like that kind
yeah.
of thing. Like I thought, that played really well for a scene that had that much weight to it. So I can't fault David Lynch for going that route because clearly it worked for what he needed it to do.
Yeah, I think when we were going in to see part two in theaters, the biggest question we had in our minds is like, how in the heck are you going to handle
Right.
Alia? Because if like she's supposed to be 3, how is Anya Taylor-Joy playing her?
Yeah.
And like, how are you going to mess with the timeline? It just seemed really confusing. But it was simple. Just she's not going to be born. She's only going to be in like dream sequences and stuff. But I will say they tackled it in 1984. I'm kind of like you. I super appreciate that they did. They're not able to devote as much time to Alia, so it's still, I feel like her killing the Baron, like the scene is effective, but I don't think the weight is the same as in the books because Alia's kind of just almost thrown in to 1984, so the weight's not quite the same. And I might like the fact that in part two, Paul gets to kill the Baron. Like some character that we're
Sure.
invested in kills the Baron,
Yeah.
other than like some character who just kind of was born.
That's fair. No, I can agree with that, and especially killing Leto Atreides and all of that.
Yeah.
Giving Paul the revenge kill, if you will. No, I think that's absolutely fair, and I think it totally works. And that whole scene works. I mean, the gravity, the weight, of Paul coming into the throne room, barging in, charging in with his army behind him, masked, and not really knowing if it is Paul Atreides or whatever, and then just, calling him grandfather, and then kills him. I mean, that is just so good.
Yeah, it is. All right, one thing I have a question about, and I would ask this to David Lynch if I could. What the hell's up with the dog in 1984? Like, why? Like, Gurney Halleck's holding this dog into battle. Like, Leto, as he's introduced, is holding this dog. Like, Fayed gives the Mentat a cat. I'm like, what is it with? There's no dogs here. Like, what is it with this dog?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of little things I think in Dune that probably David Lynch was kind of like trying to kind of make his own, if you will. And I think that there is definitely some of the kind of stuff that maybe goes to a little maybe too weird of a place. It feels very David Lynch in some ways, and I think that that's completely fair. But for a guy who kind of was roped into this situation, I feel like I won't begrudge him for trying to exert as much control and power in places where he could, because I don't think he had as much as you might think.
Right.
So yeah, and there's all kinds of weird little details like that. It's funny, like it's almost like you have to respect for it being a nod to the book readers, but it feels so weird. Like when the initial scene where they're doing the shield training and Paul's at his desk.
Those scenes are pretty identical from part one in 1984.
That's true, but the one thing that's
not identical,
right? Not identical is that when Gurney Halleck walks in, he's played by Patrick Stewart, which it's an interesting.
Sure.
That's not how, however, would have saw Gurney Halleck.
Yeah.
Like I do feel like Josh Brolin is more like what I would have thought of as Gurney Halleck. But the fact that he walked in carrying the balisette for like no real reason, that is obviously a big part of the book is him and his balisette.
Yeah.
But like the fact that he just kind of walked in with it like just randomly into this room, I felt like kind of was forced. Like it was like a detail that felt a bit forced.
Yeah, especially for a character that you don't really invest that much time in. Like I don't need the subtle background knowledge that he likes to play the balisette when he's not really going to be in the movie, like, but for 5 or 10 minutes anyway.
No, and that's a really fair point to make out a lot of the characters, because they do the first movie, like you said, in more or less the first 2/3 or do the first part one they do in the first 2/3 of 1984,
right?
And then the part two in the last third. It's like some of these characters that I feel like have weight in the book, in the in part 1 and part 2, just like just kind of lose their luster in 84 because there's just too much to do.
Yeah. Now, what about this? I thought this was an interesting change. Yui in 1984,
Dean Stockwell.
Yeah, his motivation is slightly different than in part 1 and part 2.
Yep.
In 1984, the Harkonnens killed his wife, so he is basically sabotaging the Atreides to get even with the Harkonnens, almost like cutting the heads off bull snakes.
Yeah.
Whereas in the new version, Yui, the doctor, he gives up the Atreides, but because they're holding his wife hostage and he's forced to, he's sacrificing the Atreides to save his wife's life.
And I'm pretty sure that's how it is in the book.
Yes,
if I'm not mistaken.
So I couldn't tell if I liked that or not because I'm like, I don't know if Yui doing this on like Yui instrumenting this,
right?
Yui setting the Harkonnens onto the Atreides, like it doesn't gel with the story. Like the Emperor already told us that he's the one who's doing this,
right?
So like, how is Yui in charge of it? I don't know. I do think it makes Yui more interesting.
Yeah,
but I just don't know if it worked like canon.
I think for something, you're right, that was meant to make his character seem maybe more interesting, maybe give it a little bit more
you see that internal struggle
stuff. Right
more.
But I think overall I don't think it works as well because you're right, it becomes a bit muddled, and to be fair, I mean there's a bit of that in this, again, across the board. I think that there's just some stuff that's like in 1984 that you can give them credit for swinging, but it's just, it was a miss.
And like I said, there's so much to do. You really do have to pick and choose, and that's, I guess, I do find it interesting what they were able to choose. Like, this is important, but this isn't, and then vice versa. With what, because even in as long as Dune Part 1, Part 2 is, there's still stuff that they cut and stuff that they don't do.
Yeah.
So that, like I said, they, like you mentioned, they didn't do all of his sisters, so that that swings both ways.
Yeah, 100%. Let's talk a little bit about the production design of both movies, because like I think that'll also wrap some other characters in as well. That way we're not just going character by character, but I think that we can kind of talk about this. So, I really do appreciate the 1984 production design. I really do. I think, this kind of post-Giger 1977 alien kind of design that the 80s sci-fi films were kind of doing, I think is really great, and I do think it works for Dune.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a lot of interesting design in the ships. I think there's a lot of interesting set designs in the different rooms and stuff like that, and even the costuming, like, I do think really plays almost like a punkish nature, especially when it comes to like the Harkonnens and stuff like that. I feel like they feel a little bit more punk rock in 1984 than maybe they do in Part 1 and Part 2. And that's not just because they cast Sting to be Feyd-Rautha, which we'll get to.
Sting and Bluto as the
exactly. But I mean, but I do obviously really love Denis, and I think it fits for the modern sci-fi film.
Yeah, I think it's great. I don't think there's really any problem there, especially like I thought the puppet, like the puppetry work, like the aliens look great. Those giant puppets, so like those kind of like practical special effects were great. I think a lot of the like not CGI, but those like lasers, like the however they did their ships flying in their battle scenes back in the 80s, whatever technology that was. The shields are terrible. They're absolutely horrible.
Right.
Like they're just like like they look like Minecraft bodies on top of.
They do. I didn't even think of
but they like
true.
They completely cover the actors. You can't even tell like who's fighting. So.
Right.
But again, that's a really hard thing to kind of put on film back then, and they do try, give them respect for that. But yeah, I do think the Harkonnens are really helped out and like add this layer of creepiness because of the production design. I think that went a really long way there. It's super effective in that, and I would almost say like I don't mind the Harkonnens in 1984 that much. Like really like I mind the Fremen because they're ignored and there's nothing to them.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can say that about the Harkonnens.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely true, and I think part of that does go to the actual performances themselves. I think that they're. A lot can be said for the way that they kind of portrayed each of the Harkonnen, and they got some really great people. Like I said, we mentioned Sting. Brad Dourif is in there as Peter DeVries.
Love Brad Dourif.
Right. the Baron.
Kenneth McMillan.
There you go, Kenneth McMillan. Thank you.
Paul L. Smith, who played Bluto in Popeye.
Right, with Rabin.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Bautista played in the new ones.
Right. And, I think all of those characters, I think Kenneth McMillan kind of had this very creepy element to him.
He was weird, and I don't mind it. I liked their version of the Baron. He was equally scary in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And they're all, kind of having that weird, growths all over his face and things like that. But as we said, I do obviously really enjoy, what they did with the Harkonnens and Dune Part 1 and Part 2. I mean, and it can't go wrong with Stellan Skarsgård, obviously, as Vladimir Harkonnen. I think he brings, again, a weight, pun intended, to the character that is just, off the charts. And then bringing in Austin Butler as Feyd-Rautha.
I think Austin's fine. I think he's too weird for me. I'd rather take Sting.
I mean, I don't, I guess for me, okay, so this is where I'll actually give you.
I find a lot of his stuff in Part 2 to be a little self-indulgent of Denis. Maybe took too much screen time.
Well, I think for me, it's more about building up the psychopathy of the character. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of the whole thing with what he was trying to do with Austin Butler, where he was really trying to sell who Feyd-Rautha was, where they didn't really in 1984. No. So that would be while I like Sting's performance, the bit that he's on there, it does kind of have this space pirate kind of cool guy kind of thing a bit. I think they just didn't do enough to really sell the crazy. And I think that's one thing that can be said that, Austin Butler did do well.
I will say he sold the crazy, but I will say I guess my pushback would be in Part 2, not enough where I ever would think he was going to challenge Paul and be able to beat him. I never felt like they raised him to that level in my mind. They have the big Coliseum scene where he fights two guys who are drugged and one who's not, but doesn't seem that great at it. He's hurt.
Sure.
So it's I'm all right, well, you beat three average kind of dudes. Why you're not making me think you can go and destroy Paul Atreides, who's I've watched for 5 hours on film, being an amazing fighter. So
somewhat fair. I guess.
So I just feel like like I said, it's a lot of screen time for a guy that I'm not really bought in that you're going to challenge and win at the end of this movie.
But at least they even did that scene at all, because whereas in 1984 they didn't, and that is a big scene in the book because of this idea of basically having the Baron change the perception of Feyd-Rautha of being this kind of playboy-esque type, royal figure to an actual warrior hero. Which and I appreciate the we talked about production design of the whole Getty Prime.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely.
Of that whole planet, giving it its own real look, its own feel. I mean, yes.
What is it? It has no sun or something.
It has a black sun.
Black sun. That's right. And even in 1984, when they show the 4 planets on the screen, you can see that Getty Prime is kind of blacked out.
Yeah.
So they are kind of giving that. They're acknowledging that that's what the Harkonnens live in, but they don't. They don't have time to expand on that.
For sure. And don't get me wrong, I would not begrudge you if you just thought it was a Marilyn Manson video, because there is a bit of that, especially with the black I guess figures that are on the
they're hammerhead
with the horn type things, the hammerheads, whatever. I would not begrudge you if you just thought it was a Marilyn Manson video, but as far as kind of making it a juxtaposition to the rest of what you've seen, like Caladan or Arrakis or whatever, I do appreciate that, giving it its own
definitely. When we think about movies like Star Wars, they try so hard to think of planets that have different themes and they've almost run out of things they can think of. This is a forest planet without a lake, and this is a forest planet with a lake. All right, well, Getty Prime has a black sun. Wow, that's awesome. This is definitely a style planet I've not seen yet on film. So it's great of Denis, and I love again, talk about production design. Those few minutes you're on Getty Prime in this black and white world, and they're they have the fireworks going off, but they're just liquid black because obviously you're not going to see color, so you would not have developed fireworks the same way. Who thought of that? This such a, it's on there for 3 seconds, you know what I mean? But somebody thought of it, and because it is 3 seconds, you can only get Getty Prime Express in so long, so it's got to be effective. And I just appreciate the brilliance when people are able to do stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Speaking of, genius or whatever, just keep thinking about what really both of these directors have brought into these movies, and I think about the tone of the movie, what it's saying and how it's saying it. I think is really effective. We kind of already mentioned Paul ends in 2 different places. I feel in I really wonder if people like watch part 2 of Dune and think that Paul's a hero because he's not.
No,
and just that tone to end a movie on that tone is interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, recently I was having a conversation with him about Dune, and he was talking to me about Messiah, the second book, and how Herbert wrote the book simply because he was kind of surprised how many people thought Paul was a hero.
Right.
And that's not really what he had in mind when he wrote the book, so he had to
starting
kind of
a global
recontextualize
universal war is not what a lot of heroes. Superman
Right.
doesn't do that.
Exactly, and I do think that Denis took that to heart, which I think he knew he was going to end up doing Messiah anyway as a part 3 type situation. So that makes sense, right? Which makes sense why he kind of laid the groundwork that he did. But obviously, as you said, in 1984, they don't really do any of that. You know, it seems very much like this is a good thing, and then like the rain comes and all of that. You know what I mean? Like that's just like it kind of gives it this really high ending, which neither I don't think part 1 or part 2 really have an up ending.
No.
You know what I mean? Even with Paul winning at the end. So I do think tonally, it's more to maybe what Herbert thought the book should be.
Right. Yeah. This is probably nitpicking though, because I will say I did not appreciate the 1984 ending where like the rain and like the hero has came and conquered and everything, and because it's like the Fremen didn't need a savior,
right?
You know what I mean? So I feel like it's not highlighting the parts of the book that are like that are really there, and I don't know, I don't want to sound weird, but it's like they didn't need the white guy to come in and save them, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Where because that is such a prescient, I think, thing of like Paul coming to the desert in the New Dunes is like he doesn't fit in. He's not a part of this culture. Like in the New Dunes, the Fremen are like very like people of color,
right?
Where they're not in 1984. They're just the random actors. A lot of them like old with gray hair, which is very weird. But so like having this like Caucasian come in and say to be your leader would be like, that'd be a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, well, and I think again this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about all the political side that they were able to get into Dune Part 1 and Part 2. One character that we didn't touch on, but I will touch on here at Tome because it'll kind of tie into a bigger topic, is Lady Jessica. Mm-hmm. And
Rebecca Ferguson is great.
Oh my God, she is a triumph, and I think the way that she portrays Lady Jessica, kind of torn between these two worlds of, the Atreides and the Bene Gesserit, is really compelling, because you do feel that in Part 2, especially once she becomes the Sayadina and the Reverend Mother of the Fremen, and she becomes a lightning rod, kind of, stoking the flame of the Lisan al-Gaib coming to be, and Paul being that person, and where then there's again Chani's pushback to that and all of that. Like it really kind of goes to that political intrigue that I think Herbert does so well in the books. Whereas I feel like Lady Jessica in the first movie feels just like a melodrama, female lead, and it kind of sucks because she's such a great character.
She is, and like I said, Rebecca Ferguson does such an amazing job of this, and she's really at odds with Paul again, because it's just they're on such a different journey in Part 1 and Part 2. They're both becoming the leader of the Fremen, but when you're doing one by choice and one by circumstance, it's like that you're a completely different movie, and that's so easy to see when you compare these two movies. Yeah.
But let's talk about the Bene Gesserit just for a minute, because I like I said, I think that there's such a great part of Part 1 and Part 2 and the books, obviously, but one that I feel like 1984, like they go through the motions. You know what I mean? Like they do the Gom Jabbar and like all of that stuff, and and kind of shows how they're kind of pulling strings a little bit, and they exert some power, that kind of stuff. The truthsayer for the emperor, but I think they really do capture the tone of like I said, that kind of political intrigue of how they've interwoven themselves into all the great houses. All of them all the truthsayers are Bene Gesserit, and their training and their long-term plans, which obviously you see in Dune Prophecy. For anybody that's watched that series, you kind of get a taste of like where that started, but what that's their long-term goals, which are, I mean, vast and intricate, to say the least.
Yes, they are. I will say I'll give 84 credit where I think maybe they do a hair better job, and really we're just picking at lines of dialogue here, but like where they do kind of the Reverend Mother, when she's talking with Jessica, does say you were supposed to give us a daughter,
right,
not a son. Where they don't say that specifically in, I think in part 1, part 2, like
it feels like a weird line in '84 in a way, because like how old is Paul? And have you not seen each other in 20 years or whatever? Like, this seems like a weird line. You just realized that Paul Atreides exists? That seems weird.
Hey, his choice.
Right.
But I mean, again, it's them having to over-explain maybe a little bit.
That's true.
But I think in part 1, part 2, like they do, like Leto does go up to Jessica like, you gave me a son when I asked for it. So we kind of get to it a different way.
Yeah.
The same information. But again, it's just like when picking how you're going to handle the Bene Gesserit is going to also depict how the tone of your movie, because how you display witches basically
right.
is tough and stuff. So, where they were willing to go tonally with 1984 and where they were wanting and do go with the new ones is, like I said, it is a different end of the spectrum.
Yeah. But like I said, I just think that they handled the tone well, and I can appreciate that, because that is one thing about the book. As we said earlier, it's so dense, it's so intriguing in the way that they're able to kind of create this drama and tension of politics and the inner workings of it and how intricate it is. And again, they're really only scratching the surface in part 1 and part 2. I mean, the books are so much more dense than even they're able to get to. So you just have to commend them for being able to get as much as they did. But again, it obviously compared to 1984, it just makes it so much more of a compelling movie.
Yeah. All right, well, maybe let's wind this conversation down. I think, unfortunately, fortunately, we're huge fans of the book. I'm a huge fan of part 1 and part 2, and I watched 1984's version not too long ago, before part 2 came out, and I thought, this is not good. When I watch it this time, I can kind of like maybe appreciate more what they were trying to do, and when you now see Denis finished part 2, like how that kind of filled out, what they were able to invest time in, I feel like I just watched 1984 with a little bit different lens, because I see the time constrictions that they had.
Yeah.
And I bet some of the stuff they had to take out in 1984 was tough, and they didn't want to do it. They had to do it. And I feel like I appreciate 1984 more because they had to do as much with very, very little.
Yeah.
And so, like, is 1984 a great movie? No, but they didn't do a bad job for what they were tasked to do.
Yeah. Well, and it's just so unfortunate because
David Lynch was brought in to
do this movie. And he was the fourth director to actually attempt.
Three people said no way, it's not possible.
Well, they tried. I mean, Ridley Scott tried. Alejandro Jodorowsky tried. I mean, there's a whole documentary about Jodorowsky's Dune, and I think that there is definitely a world where that works, because there is one thing about Dune is there is a very psychedelic element to Dune that neither movie really tries to do. I mean, maybe 84 tries to do a little bit more, which some of that weird stuff.
Which is why we're not going to get another Dune movie past Dune 3, probably, because it gets a little weird.
Right, and that's fair. But man, I want children.
I would love it.
I want children Dune so bad. But yeah, no, I don't necessarily disagree with you. But it's hard to blame David Lynch for this because it feels like such a studio thing. And in fact, I even read a little thing about Jodorowsky, who went and watched this movie after, and he was kind of mad. He's like, they went and got David Lynch, because in his mind, I guess he thought he was the only other person besides Jodorowsky who could do this well. And it was funny, like he was sitting there watching the movie, and he was very happy because of how bad it was, but not because he could tell it wasn't David Lynch's fault.
Right.
It was the studio's fault.
Right.
And I mean, I don't think that is off base in any way, shape, or form. With a book like Dune, trying to do it all in one movie is a fool's errand.
Absolutely.
I mean, without question.
We talk about reasons for why you make a copy of a copy, and I would say maybe even up to just 8 hours ago when we were doing this, I may have thought that the reason why you made Dune remake is because 1984 sucked, and you're going to make it longer, you're going to make it better. And I don't feel like that right now. I feel like the reason why you redid 94 is because it was too short.
Yeah.
Not because it sucked, but because it was too short. They didn't invest the proper resources into it. So now we are going to do it justice. We're going to invest $400 million into it, and then we're going to see what we get. And what they got was a great movie.
Yeah, and like I said, I hope in some ways we've been able to defend 1984 to a certain degree, because there is a lot of hate. There was a lot of it flopped when it came out.
Sure.
It basically relegated David Lynch to not obscurity, but not big Hollywood movies for the rest of his career. Which, you know what? That's actually, I think, a silver lining to all of this, because after this is when we got things like Blue Velvet. Well, I mean, we've talked about Blue Velvet on this show. I mean, David Lynch found Kyle MacLachlan while doing this movie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's fortuitous in a way, you know, to have been able to have that meeting happen on this film that, you know, it ultimately flopped. But like I said, I think there's a lot of redeeming factors. I think, like we said, the production design is still really great. It fits that 80s sci-fi so
fits
well.
The Harkonnens.
It does. You know, those little designs, I think, just, you know, work really, really well. You know, we talked about the Alia, you know, trying to do Alia, and even the way that they did it, I think, was really effective. One thing that we didn't mention, that I'm going to mention right now, is actually the Mentats.
Oh, yeah.
Because we didn't talk about Mentats, but I think that's one thing that actually Dune 1984 maybe did better than Dune Part 1 and Part 2. If I could point something out, I would say that is Mentats. I think that, you know, they were able to, Hawat was, you know, almost non-existent in a lot of ways in Part 1, and then completely non-existent in Part 2.
Yeah, they actually cut him.
And then, you know, but between Pitar and Hawat in Dune 84, I thought they did a pretty good job of at least explaining what the Mentat was.
Yeah.
Because I don't. That's one thing in Part 1 and Part 2. I just don't feel like they did.
No,
so
they don't.
You know, there's some redeeming qualities to 1984 that I think, you know, can easily be overlooked, but shouldn't.
All right, well, that's going to wrap up our conversations on Dune Part 1 and Part 2 and Dune 1984. Rob and I we're Dune talking, but we need the audience to Dune a little more stuff for us.
Oh my God,
that's
really,
bad.
That's where you went, huh?
That was a bad pun. Anyway, it would be really bad if the audience doesn't like this podcast, have the opportunity to subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a 5-star review, because if you do, we're going to read it live on air someday. Don't forget, you guys can email us at carrayrob@gmail.com or reach out to us on Blue Sky at carrayrob.
That's right. You can also now find us on Facebook and Instagram. By all means, go check us out on those platforms. See all the fun things we're doing over there. If there is a comment section on whatever platform you're listening to us on, by all means, let us know what you thought of Dune 1984, Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2, the book. We just want to know everything.
Tell us what
that
you
like love about Dune. Nothing bad, though. We want nothing bad.
There is nothing bad.
There is, well, I'm sure some people will say something bad about 1984. But we will be back next week with Ray's episode of Say Hello to My Little Film.
Yep, God. It's my turn.
Yep, we have too many shows. I can't keep track of anything. And then we will be back in 2 weeks with this month's Hello Movies, My Old Friend, where Ray and I are going to be revisiting the MTV movie classic Joe's Apartment.
Pretty much on the 30th anniversary of that movie to date almost. So that's going to be crazy.
Day. Yeah, that is fortuitous to say the least. But we will be back next month with a brand new episode of A Copy of a Copy. And Ray and I are doing something we have never done before. And this is a movie, an original and a remake done by the same director.
Yes, we've never done that. It's going to be interesting to see why he did that.
Yes, absolutely. And that is because we are doing the 1956 The Man Who Knew Too Much, starring Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day, directed by the great Alfred Hitchcock, as well as the 1934 film of the same name, starring Peter Lorre.
It's never been said about us that we know too much.
No, I don't think anybody would ever say that about us. But you know what? You know you don't want to miss it. But until then, this is Car Ray Rob.
Where I'm Ray.
And I'm Rob. And remember, be defined by the films you love, not the ones you hate.
A copy of a copy. 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 A copy of a copy.